Lachlan, if we talk a little bit actually about the training, you guys also assess the training volume, particularly the aerobic training volume. So for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with bodybuilding and peaking for competition, I think aerobic training has kind of gotten a little bit of, less attention, let's say, as of late with the HIIT training and everything being so popular. Can you talk about the aerobic training volumes of these participants as they led up to peak week?
Yeah, sure. So again, there's a bit of variability here. So some of the guys swear by it, other guys, they just don't even care. They don't even touch aerobic training. So the idea is they're trying to increase their energy deficit through diet, but also through exercise energy expenditure. So, they perform aerobic training to more or less target excess energy expenditure as opposed to looking to increase aerobic capacity, that type of stuff. That's not really what they're interested in. As I said, there's variability. Some of the guys were performing aerobic work, other guys weren't performing any aerobic work. So if you look at over the 9 participants, just an average measure, it doesn't really appear to be all that significant, the amount of aerobic work that they're doing. But if you look in a little bit more detail at an individual basis, some of them were performing a fairly high amount of aerobic work, so 3 to 4 sessions a week of 30 to 45 minutes of aerobic work. The work that they're doing does vary as well. Some of them still have this idea that if they go above a certain heart rate, then they're going to start burning muscle mass, so you just got to stay in that low intensity steady state work, which typically means just going for a walk around the block for 30, 40 minutes. Others, they're more thinking, well, if I can perform really high intensity work, I can perform a shorter duration session, I can really increase my metabolism and burn off a lot of energy, and that's going to have a greater effect in the long run. So some of them were performing interval training. Some of them used, interval work in a gym setting, so using more of a circuit style training with different resistance training exercises that they could do, and that's more focusing not on trying to maintain muscle mass, but more trying to burn off energy, basically. So there's a bit of variability there. As I said, some of the guys were just not doing any aerobic work, and they say diet is enough for me. I don't need to add in any aerobic work to achieve that energy deficit. I could just do it all through diet. And I think that does reflect the broader bodybuilding community. There are certainly some guys who don't do any aerobic work, and then there are some guys that really focus a lot on aerobic work, particularly as they get in that sort of 4 to 8 week period before the show where they really need to start dialing in and burning off that last little bit of fat mass. They'll ramp up their aerobic work. I think there is this concern amongst bodybuilders, and it's probably somewhat valid, in that the more aerobic work you're doing, then there is this potential that you're going to be losing a little bit more lean mass. And I think that's where trying to be, again, strategic with your diet, so using carbohydrates strategically and making sure you're consuming enough protein will allow you to achieve that fat loss without going too much into the muscle mass. But certainly, as I said, there's variability there, and in the different competitors as to their approach to aerobic training, if they do aerobic training at all. What types they do, as I said, some of them are low steady state, others are doing interval work, walking around the block, jumping on an elliptical or a bike, or doing sprints, for example. There's a lot of variability there.
I imagine personal preference probably comes into it, and as you mentioned before, probably the coach they're working with and the different strategies they like to use probably gets influenced as well in terms of what they choose to do, right?
Yeah, I think so. In particular, the personal preference is very important. If you're not enjoying it, then you're probably going to be less likely to do it. Certainly, the coach does have a big influence on the competitors, particularly the less experienced ones. They're going to be very much guided by what the coach is recommending. Unfortunately, there are some coaches out there who don't have the experience and the training or the education to be providing the best advice. And in that situation, they're going to be very much guided by what their own opinions are in terms of whether or not aerobic training should be performed, and then obviously that will be reflected in what the athlete themselves are doing. But yes, very much the coaches do play a large part in that. I think they're usually checking in with the coach every few weeks in terms of their body composition, both through potentially skin folds, but also just through physique, looking at photos, that type of stuff, through posing. And the coach just may say, okay, we need to lose a little bit more, we need to ramp it up a little bit, so let's add in some aerobic work, or no, you're on track, I don't think we need to add in too much at this point in time.
Terrific. And Lachlan, as the contest prep obviously gets closer and closer in preparation to peak for the event, obviously energy stores are decreasing, so we typically see a reduction in resting metabolic rate. How was the RMR impacted in your bodybuilders?
Yeah, this was a really interesting finding for us. in that there weren't really any findings. So there weren't really significant reductions in resting metabolic rate over that 16-week period leading up to the competition. As you said, when you start to get quite low in your body composition in terms of body fat percentage, then you would expect to see reductions in resting metabolic rate. We didn't find that. I think there's potentially a few different reasons, and the maintenance of lean mass is probably the most important one there. So even though they were able to lose fat mass, they were successful in maintaining lean mass. And we know that, as people would say, lean mass is more metabolically active than fat mass. So if they're able to maintain their muscle mass, then theoretically that would maintain their resting metabolic rate. They're also performing a lot of resistance training, and we know resistance training does increase metabolic rate. Even over a 24 to 48 hour period, their metabolic rate is going to be maintained, and they're performing 4 sessions a week usually of resistance training. So that obviously would bump up their metabolic rate for a fairly long period of time over that 7-day week period. I think also our testing protocol may have affected that a little bit, in that we got them in 8 weeks out from the show, and then we got them in again 1 week out from the show. And we know that they go through certain strategies in that week leading up to the competition, particularly dietary strategies where they increase their energy intake, which potentially would have an effect on resting metabolic rate. So I was hypothesizing that they would, in particular in that week before the show, we would see a significant reduction in resting metabolic rate compared to the previous measures. As I said, we found that it more or less stayed the same. Some of them went up a little bit, others dropped a little bit, others stayed the same in terms of the different participants. But from an average perspective, there was no significant change there. I think if we got them in a week beforehand, 2 weeks out from the show, prior to their peak week strategy, where they're going to be increasing their dietary intake, we potentially could have seen some reductions in resting metabolic rate. Hindsight, I guess you learn these types of things, but overall, really, I think the high protein intake, which allowed them to maintain their lean mass, the lower energy deficit, which allowed them to maintain their lean mass, the high resistance training protocol that they're following, I think they were the key factors which prevented a reduction in resting metabolic rate in these guys. And ultimately, if you can maintain your resting metabolic rate, it means you don't need to reduce your energy intake as much in order to maintain an energy deficit, which means you can still lose fat mass without dropping your energy intake so much, which ultimately has this positive feedback mechanism whereby your resting metabolic rate isn't going to continue to reduce because you don't have to cut down as much in your energy intake, and your energy expenditure as well doesn't need to increase so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the ideal scenario. And do you think that would be different in maybe sort of recreational bodybuilders who aren't following maybe such an evidence-based approach, or who aren't as perhaps tuned into their training and what fits them best?
Yeah, I certainly would think so. So guys who potentially need to lose a lot more fat mass in that preparatory period, likely going to be going through a more aggressive energy cut in order to lose that fat mass. And you probably would find, or I would expect to find, some more significant reductions in resting metabolic rate. Again, if I refer to the couple of case studies that have been published, they found some pretty significant reductions in resting metabolic rate over that competition preparation period. And that basically means you need to be reducing your energy intake more and more and more in order to lose fat mass the closer you get to the competition. So certainly, and that's not to suggest that those case studies, those guys weren't following evidence-based practice. I think just the total fat mass that they needed to lose was so much more than what the guys I was looking at was, that ultimately they did end up losing more lean mass. They saw greater reductions in resting metabolic rate, whereas these guys didn't need to lose as much fat mass, didn't need to go into such an aggressive energy deficit, didn't reduce their lean mass so much, and therefore they were able to maintain their resting metabolic rate. More recreational athletes, more recreational bodybuilders, or even guys who aren't looking to compete, but certainly just to cut down for whatever reason to look a little bit better when they're strutting around on the beach, for example. Now, those guys who are, yeah, that's right, coming up into summer here and the budgie smugglers, certainly those types of guys who are going to be using more aggressive cuts, I would dare say that they're going to be facing some reductions in their resting metabolic rate.
Definitely slow and steady seems to be the best way to go about it. Now, what about hormone levels, things like testosterone, IGF-1? How are they impacted in this study?
Yeah, again, another interesting finding, certainly from previous evidence looking at bodybuilders, but also other studies that have just looked at significant energy reductions, low energy availability. You see this significant reduction in certain hormones, and that's what we found here. Looking at testosterone, IGF-1, those concentrations, serum concentrations of those hormones did reduce over that 16-week period. Some of them dropped below the normal range, the reference range for testosterone and IGF-1. So some of the participants did find that in that acute period leading up to the competition. And that, I would suggest, that would reflect some degree of low energy availability. We weren't able to assess that directly because we couldn't measure exercise energy expenditure. So we can't absolutely say with 100% confidence that it was low energy availability, but certainly the symptoms in terms of low hormone concentration and also what they're going through and previous evidence would suggest that there is some degree of low energy availability there. Yeah, that's right. What was the effect on this? Well, we know that although those hormones reduced, they were still able to maintain their lean mass. Their resting metabolic rate didn't drop down significantly. So you could make an argument that in that acute period of time, short-term reduction in those anabolic hormones doesn't seem to have too much of a negative impact on physique, on body composition, on performance. And that's given this is a bodybuilding performance as opposed to other athletic performance. So certainly that acute period, if those anabolic hormones are reduced, doesn't seem to be too negative. If you look at prolonging that low hormone concentration to a longer period of time, then I would suggest that there may be some negative implications associated with that. Potentially you could start to lose lean mass a little bit more, potentially reductions in resting metabolic rate. But for these guys, they're focusing on one day. They prepare for a long period of time. If their testosterone levels drop below normal values for 4 weeks, and it means that they ultimately look good on stage, and then they can either reverse diet or they just start to increase their energy intake, their protein intake. Usually stays the same, but carbohydrate, fat, energy intake goes up after the competition. Then the hormone values typically start to respond. Yeah, that's right. And the hormones respond fairly well, and it goes back up to that normal range. That acute period where you're below the normal range or you've got a low testosterone IGF-1 value, it doesn't seem to be too effective and I guess negatively affect these outcomes for these guys, given that they're focusing purely on that one day where they get on stage.